Welcome to the Gestalt Get Together. The Gestalt Get Together is your podcast for discussing the state of the evidence around Gestalt language processing, the importance of musical language, as well as considering psychoacoustics for the autistic neurotype, and how our field is responding to the growing world of GLP and NLA discourse. Whether you're joining for a live recording with Speech Therapy PD, you're joining for an interview with a loved one of a GLP or a GLP themselves, or maybe joining for a research deep dive, I am thrilled to be sharing my passion for working with Gestalt language processors with you. My name is Corinne Zmoos, MS CCC SLP, and I am a speech language pathologist and musician whose aim is to investigate psychoacoustics, music theory, and musical syntax in Gestalt language processors, while also sharing my excitement about this framework and how to work with kids who fit this profile. I love GLPs. I work with them every single day. They're basically my whole caseload. And I've had massive success using ideas from the proposed frameworks to help GLPs. But I also identify myself as lovingly skeptical because I want more information. I want way more data, and I want a lot more evidence to support these ideas and make sure that the interventions I'm providing for GLPs are as effective as possible. I basically live in the journals. You don't want to know how many tabs I have open right now. So if you're a busy SLP who's looking for interesting information around GLP, autism, and all of the related ideas, this podcast is a place to go to get synthesis and commentary without having to do all the digging yourself. I try to synthesize ideas from the worlds of language, music, and neuroscience so you can grow your knowledge base and feel more confident working with GLPs. This live podcast recording with Speech Therapy PD is 1 hour, 30 minutes and is offered for 0.15 ASHA CEUs. If you're joining us live and your state license requires live CEUs, please be sure to complete all the course modules, including the one that says Complete Course, before the end of the day on your Speech Therapy PD account. If you think you're going to need support to complete everything that you need to get credit for this course, make sure that you stay to the end of the episode so that we can share ways to support you, because we want to make sure you get credit for your hard work and showing up for this live recording. If you're listening to a playback of this podcast episode on a streaming service, I want to welcome you too. So in this live episode, I am really excited to be talking about two of my favorite topics, things that I want to learn much, much more about. And those two things are melody and memory. In particular, we're going to be framing this discussion or this presentation of some foundational research around stage 1 of Gestalt language processing. But I want to make sure that you know what I want you to come away knowing from this. What are our learning outcomes? The first learning outcome, my goal for you as a listener, is to be able to define musical memory. You may be able to define memory in a general sense, but what does it mean to have musical memory? Another outcome I have for you as a listener is I'd love for you to be able to describe why musical memory may be more salient than other forms of memory. Why is it that we can remember songs from when we were in middle school, but we can't remember what someone said to us yesterday? Why is it so salient? Another aim of this episode is I would love for listeners to be able to outline at least 3 differences that are happening in the autistic neurotype that may be related to musical memory or melodic processing. What are the differences at the brain level that make music such a powerful modality for autistic children to engage in learning? And finally, I would love for listeners to come away from this episode being able to list and describe at least 3 melodic techniques that they can use with Gestalt language processors. And yes, even if you're not a musician, I would love for you to at least try these out and see what happens. Now, to set the stage, and yeah, stage, we want to set the stage for the stage. What is stage 1? we want to rewind back to the 1980s and talk about a researcher named Barry Prezant. If you're interested in Gestalt language processors, natural language acquisition, this whole world, Barry Prezant is a name that you need to know. And his papers and the papers he wrote with colleagues are, I consider them to be required reading for understanding these kids on your caseload and getting to know this profile or this potential learning style and processing style. So I highly recommend looking into his papers. They're beautifully written. And I know for me, every time I revisit them, I try and read them often because they're such seminal works. I see my clients in the way he wrote. He's describing my clients, but just in the 1980s. So let's talk about what stage 1 refers to, because when we're talking about melody and memory, very often I'm going to be using the techniques that I'm going to teach you at the end of the episode with kids who present as stage 1 Gestalt language processors. In the early 1980s, Barry Prezant researched and published works about autistic communication patterns in children. He researched and published about language acquisition patterns as well. Now, at that time, he described the children that he was working with as presenting with this longer than expected or longer than anticipated usage of Gestalt patterns. And now, if you're interested in learning more about what the word Gestalt refers to, there's a previous episode called So What is a Gestalt?, where we talk about the psychological definition, the history of Gestalt thinking. It's derived from German Gestalt psychology. So when we think about Gestalt thinking, that's an episode I recommend going back to learn more about that. And Barry Prezant, he described how these children seem to rely upon situational gestalts within their episodic memory. These memories that are situational gestalts, they're way more than just getting the gist of something. They're way more than just kind of a summary or an impression of what happened. I know for myself, I have a very poor memory. It's something that I find very frustrating, but I'm accepting it about myself. For me, my memories are more so impressions. They're more so a vibe of what happened. I do not have the detailed representation of what I've experienced in my life that would be considered a situational gestalt. And I want to explain why. Situational gestalts, per Prezant in his writing, these are sensorial wholes. They are these whole packages that where the memory is this intersecting combination of all the incoming signals of every sensory element that that person experienced at the time of it being encoded. So at the moment that that memory was made, there is a sensorial combination that is completely included. And so what that means is there is a stamp of that moment, at least in the way that we're describing it and trying to understand it. A lot of these are ideas that we're trying to explore and research, but that at the moment that that memory was made, the moment of encoding of that child's experience, they encoded things like the smell, the proximity to other people, all the visual input, every sound happening in that moment, the emotion that we're feeling. If there's music playing, did they have felt safety? What was happening in terms of neuroception? Interoceptive cues, how high up were they? How low down were they? Were they in pain? All of those sensory data points, according to the ideas around Gestalt processing, are included in that memory. And this can be wonderful and it can also be heartbreaking, all of those sensations are then accessed when that memory is recalled. So I can speak from my own experience. When I think back to a childhood memory, it's fuzzy, it's an imprint, it's an impression, there's a vibe. I might remember kind of what someone said in that moment, but a Gestalt language processor would, theoretically, remember whether their stomach hurt in that moment, exactly where they stood in the room, who else was in the room, how high up were they, what was their height. All of those details are encoded in that memory as a full sensory whole. Now, the smaller elements of that, and to us, that might be small, Like maybe that there was a water bottle on the table in that memory. To us, that might be a small detail, but to the Gestalt language processor, that smaller element cannot be easily parsed out. And on the other side of that, we may not understand why the water bottle was such an important part of that memory. But to that child, to that Gestalt language processor, the water bottle was just as important as what the person next to them was saying in the memory, was just as important as what they were doing with their toys. Every single element of that moment in time, of moment in their history, was equally as important, because that is the idea of Gestalt. Gestalt is the whole, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But I think it's helpful to share an example. And I tried to come up with an example that was striking because we're talking about memory and I want it to be something that you'll remember. So I hope that this is a striking example that will stick with you. So I'm thinking about an example like this. The smaller elements of a memory cannot be easily parsed out by a child. Let's say that child, let's say a child in your life, they see a rubber duck. And then you see that they are overcome by fear and they start yelling, I'm sorry, are you okay? I'm sorry, are you okay? I'm sorry, are you okay? The same way over and over. So you stop and you think, okay, they just saw a rubber duck. They're panicking. And they keep saying the same phrase over and over, and it sounds really similar each time. Now, to an outsider who may not know this child or who wasn't there at the moment of the encoding we'll talk about, the rubber duck is just an object. And an object that could have really endless combinations, possibilities. I know a rubber duck could be in a cartoon, a rubber duck can be in a store, a rubber duck can be in a bathtub, a rubber duck can be in a Jeep, because people who drive Jeeps love to have rubber ducks in them. A rubber duck doesn't have just one meaning. It can have a lot. An outsider might also think that a rubber duck is kind of a neutral object. It has a neutral emotional valence to it. In the grand scheme of things, who really cares? It's just a rubber duck. But for that Gestalt language processor, who just so happened the first time they ever saw a rubber duck was when they were 2 years old, and they were in the bath. And they slipped below the water. Their head went below the water right when their caregiver turned around. And for about 5 seconds, that child was underwater, didn't know how to swim, was panicking. They encoded the sight of the rubber duck with that feeling of being underwater and panicking. Now, that child associates all the sights and sounds of that sensorial whole to different degrees with the panic of being underwater. For them, the rubber duck is not neutral. It is tied to the emotional, contextual whole, and that rubber duck signals a whole body memory. That is the idea of Gestalt. It is the whole of it that is called upon, not the smaller elements being parsed out. That comes later with the right types of intervention and support. Those are kids in stage 4 and beyond, when we are really starting to parse out little tiny pieces. Now, you might think about, why were they yelling, I'm sorry, are you okay? Who do you think they heard that from in the moment? That was what their caregiver said. When their caregiver turned around and realized that the child's head was underwater, they pulled them out and they yelled that. And that child attached that language to the feeling. They attached that feeling to the rubber duck. And it is all combined together. Now, these are linguistic gestalts, such as, I'm sorry, are you okay? Maybe, like one of my clients, a child who sings an entire song to me to request a piece of food. They don't say the single word, they're not there yet, but they'll sing, I like to eat apples and bananas, to ask for something from the fridge. They don't want apples and bananas. Let me tell you, they do not want to eat that fruit. But they've attached that string of sound, that string of words, musically laden words. I like to eat apples and bananas. They've attached that to the feeling of being hungry and the feeling of wanting to request more. Another linguistic gestalt might be a child in a daycare or a school yelling, "Let's get ready to rumble!" when he sees two of his peers beating each other up in the sandbox. Because when he first witnessed two humans beating each other up, it was on TV during a boxing match, and he heard that phrase. So now there is this gestalt, this linguistic gestalt that maps onto the visuals of people tussling. All of these linguistic gestalts, they speak to what Barry Prezant described as stage one. Stage one is characterized by these whole language gestalts, things like phrases. So let's get ready to rumble. Perhaps it speaks to entire movie scripts, song lyrics, YouTube videos, maybe even sound effects. I have a couple of clients I work with now where we communicate in sound effects. And those are some of the easiest things for them to try and use their mouth to produce because they're a little bit shorter. But sound effects capture a feeling and a moment and a context, usually that they've pulled from a video. Now, all of these linguistic gestalts, and I could argue that the sound effects are less linguistic, but all of them refer to that original sensorial wholeness of that memory. And they are deeply, deeply personal to that child. And that's often what Marge Blanc calls detective work. And we'll talk about Marge Blanc in just a moment. But she refers to this as doing the detective work. That's on the part of therapists and parents and other people in this child's life to figure out what is the meaning of that gestalt to the child in front of me. And my favorite gestalts are the ones where none of the single words within that phrase or lyric or script have anything to do with that true underlying meaning. Those are the ones that are really exciting and satisfying to uncover and figure out what they mean. And it's this incredible aha moment when you realize, oh, you're saying or singing this because the first time you heard it was when this was happening. And you just see all the pieces come together. That's so much of stage one. Now, beyond stage one, Prezant described 3 additional stages, 2, 3, and 4, of how autistic children parse out these original wholes and parse them smaller, smaller, smaller until then they get down to those single units or those morphemes to then be able to start building those grammatical generative utterances, similarly to what we see in their younger neurotypical peers. But a lot of the claims of Prezant and Blanc and all those who are looking into and researching and have written about Gestalt language processors are that it's a similar process that autistic children and GLPs go through a similar process of language acquisition. It's just more protracted and it is delayed. Now, I want to talk more about Marge Blanc and her work, which is the reason that I am sitting here speaking to you right now, is because of the work that Marge Blanc did. And I'm really, really grateful for all the efforts that her team, and everyone who has invested in this since then has done, because that's why I get to, chat about this and share this information. It's important that we note that her longitudinal clinical work, which was published in 2012 in her book, described the similar overall patterns that Prezant talked about in the 80s. Following that 4-stage pattern, she did describe and add on 2 additional stages, which have to do with increasing complexity of grammar. But Marge Blanc noted that many children who presented with these stage 1 gestalts, like let's get ready to rumble, or I like to eat apples and bananas, they moved through this parsing process through the stages and the recombining process once they get to stages 3 and 4, when and if they are provided the right conditions. And that is so much of what speech and language therapy is creating the optimal conditions for skill acquisition. So if these GLPs are provided the right linguistic conditions, the right sensory conditions, and the right social emotional environments for their thinking and learning styles, then these children can move through the stages and move into generative language. Not for everyone, because we know all brains and bodies are different, and some brains and bodies are able to move into the more complex combinations and some aren't. But what was interesting about Marge's work was she was able to really see at the clinical level that this approach and looking at these stages and the techniques that she developed and pulled from other places, this was effective for children for whom other intervention techniques, other intervention approaches had not panned out. For families where it was kind of that idea of they tried everything and it wasn't working. And I know that I can speak from my own anecdotes that most of my caseload, it's changing now that more and more people in my area know about Gestalt language processing and are seeking out those supports earlier, but I still have a sizable amount of my caseload where it's families for whom nothing else has worked. They struck out or they plateaued. And now they're shifting into this approach for GLP and they're seeing the results panning out. Blanc expressed in her original work, and she continues to advocate for the things that I talk about and I research when it comes to music. High intonation, not talking in a boring way like this. Let's play the piano. But instead, highly intoned modeling that captures underlying emotion and is really, really emphasizing the underlying meaning. These are emotionally enhanced language models. And also, try and use this to tap into the child's current interest and their current sensorial experience, rather than contrived, decontextualized language teaching. So, for example, if I'm working with a child and they're climbing up a ladder in my clinic, I'm gonna have my voice go up too, because I want my voice to match what their body is experiencing. Can we make as much of that moment match up in terms of what they're hearing, feeling, seeing, and doing? Now, Marge and I often talked about how prevalent musicality is with my Gestalt language processors and the ones that she worked with and continues to work with. Whether that be our shared experiences with clients having perfect pitch, a penchant for instruments, impressive musical memory, or their ability to communicate through song, especially in stage 1. Their memory for music and the saliency of musical information is often astounding. Now, why might this be? Now that we've kind of set the stage of stage 1, we want to start to talk about why. I want to explore in this episode a couple of articles about melody and memory so that we can just start to scratch the surface of why music might be such a powerful change agent for Gestalt language processors and why it might make such a difference for language acquisition for autistic children. So what I want to start with is by talking about working memory and working memory research. We're going to look at a couple of articles to start to pique your interest about why memory and melody are important things to know about for the kids you work with. Working memory is critical for almost everything we do. It's especially important for language processing and language acquisition. And so I want to talk a bit about the differences that we might see in autistic working memory. If autistic working memory is somehow different or reduced or impacted, we could, see why language acquisition, language processing would also be impacted. So there were 2 meta-analyses that I found from 2017 and 2019 that looked at working memory, and I wanted to share the results of those. In 2017, Wang et al. Published a meta-analysis about working memory impairments in autism spectrum disorders. They looked at 28 studies that were specifically looking at working memory. And in total, these studies included 819 autistic participants and 875 non-autistic individuals included in that data set. Now, the results of the meta-analysis found that there was a statistically significant trend of impairment in working memory in the autistic participants in these studies. And something interesting was they noted that in these studies, spatial working memory was more impacted than verbal working memory. Both of them were impacted. So there's impacts on spatial working memory. There's impacts on verbal working memory, both of which are really important in classrooms, in the home, to be able to engage in the daily routine and learn. But definitely cool to note that they saw that spatial working memory was more so impacted than verbal. I know when I read that, I was surprised because there's, there's impressions we have of, visual learning being stronger. And so making the assumption that spatial working memory would also be stronger. It's just always so interesting when we look at brain research, how kind of our like gut impressions and the way that we engage in like closure of ideas. So for me, like I engaged in closure by thinking, oh, well, if the visual skills are really strong for my client, spatial working memory would also be strong. But some of the research isn't showing that. When it comes to the Discrimination article from 2020, their paper was entitled Memory and Autism Spectrum Disorder, a meta-analysis of experimental studies. This was a much bigger meta-analysis. They actually looked at 64 studies, and they had 2,923 autistic participants across those studies and 2,877 non-autistic participants. Overall, from this meta-analysis, they found that autistic participants experienced greater challenges with short-term memory compared to long-term memory. And here's an interesting connection. They found that the overarching trend was that visual memory was more so impacted than verbal memory. So that's why I wanted to talk about these two together, is because 2017, 2020, two meta-analyses looking at different types of memory, they're seeing that the visual memory is more so impacted than verbal. Now, these are for adults, but definitely interesting to see what people are finding related to memory capacity and memory performance. There was also in the Desonnet meta-analysis a trend that there was a reduced ability to engage in what's called free recall, which is being able to recall something without support. And the autistic participants were better able to engage in recall when they were recognizing something or benefiting from cueing rather than just freely pulling it out of their head. And this may ring true for you if you work with autistic children, that providing certain types of cues and supports is really, really helpful for them engaging in routines and engaging in learning opportunities rather than the free recall. And so this is just a nice emphasis of why those supports are so important to provide, because free recall, even for studies that, when we're looking at adults, are something that are going to be beneficial potentially throughout the lifespan. So this was a paper from 2022 by Han et al., and it was entitled Effects of Working Memory Load on Frontal Connectivity in Children with Autism Spectrum Disorder, an FNIRS study. And I'm often thinking about the frontal lobe when I'm thinking about working with Gestalt language processors, because that's where we're seeing so much mediation of language and executive functioning to be able to achieve some of the big goals we have for our clients. So this 2022 study, it looked at the impact of working memory load. How hard is your brain working? How hard are you taxing your working memory for a particular task? And they looked at working memory load on functional connectivity within an area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And they're looking at autistic children comparing to neurotypical participants. They wanted to study how this working memory load modulates performance and whether it's tied to altered connectivity in this part of the brain. So a common theme throughout the autistic neurotype is different connectivity. Hyperconnectivity is, we're seeing more and more results from research of this hyperconnectivity in different parts of the brain, but there's also parts of the brain that have hypoconnectivity. But overall, just a big takeaway is that the autistic brain is structurally different, which I think is a really important point to take away, because I know I come up against advocacy moments where there's ideas around, well, why can't they just do this? Well, why can't they're just being lazy? They're just being this, they're just being stubborn. And I think it's really helpful to be able to say, actually, down to the level of the neuron, their brains are different. And so they may need different supports and conditions to thrive. So I like to have articles like this to be able to point to that, to the level of the connectivity in the brain, to the synapse, their brains are different. And so it is okay to have different supports and interventions and accommodations to help them grow and thrive. So the measurement tool for this study was a measuring tool that I hadn't heard of before. So I wanted to share more about it. It's called Functional Near Infrared Spectroscopy, FNIRS. So this is a brain imaging technique. It's not invasive, and they measure blood oxygen changes. It's similar to fMRI, but they're looking at blood oxygenation. And when we're thinking about oxygenation, we're thinking about where are the resources going in the brain to complete tasks. What parts of the brain are being oxygenated more than others? So FNIRS is a technique. It's based upon, I thought this is so cool, changes in the absorption of light that are emitted by sources onto the surface of the head and then measured by detectors. So there's light emitted by sources onto the surface of the head. So we're putting light onto the head surface. And then how are the light waves being absorbed differently? That's giving us information about the oxygen changes. This stuff blows my mind. So cool. So in the study, they looked at 22 autistic children between 8 to 12 years old, and they had 24 matched neurotypical peers. Overall, what they found is that the autistic participants had slower reaction times during conditions when their working memory load was low. So they were less able to react quickly when their working memory was more taxed. They specifically saw this in the right hemisphere, and they saw that there were different connectivity patterns in the right hemisphere than the neurotypical matched controls. So there's different connection types, and the pattern of connectivity was different than you would expect in a neurotypical brain. They also showed that there were different oxygenation patterns in the lateral prefrontal cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex of that right hemisphere. And so oxygenation was happening differently in the autistic brain when working memory was being taxed. And you think about language really taxes working memory. And so you can kind of start to see how language acquisition might be challenging if we're using kind of regular spoken language input, if the connectivity is fundamentally different in the autistic brain. And we've got a recent study here. This is by Liu et al. In 2023. This was entitled Replicable Patterns of Memory Impairments in Children with Autism and Their Links to Hyperconnected Brain Circuits. So here we are talking about hyperconnectivity again. That is definitely a buzzword I'd love for you to take away from this episode. And I recommend looking into hyperconnectivity. It's going to give you a wealth of research and ideas about how this phenomena might be impacting your client's ability to acquire language and what we can do to help them. So in this study, this was looking at 25 autistic children, and then they had 29 neurotypical age-matched children. They were looking at something called the default mode network. They wanted to study memory challenges and memory deficits as related to this default mode network. So what is the default mode network? Definitely a term I recommend looking into more. We don't have a lot of time in this episode to get into the details of it. There's so much to learn about it. But to sum it up, the default mode network is theorized to be associated with cognitive functions and memory functions, and it's kind of this underlying default mode of the brain to accomplish these tasks that help us get through the day. Now, there's a lot of theories and findings about how the default mode network tends to be atypical and have some areas of dysfunction, which is a term that I know can feel really harsh when we're talking about it, but that is the language that the researchers used. Dysfunctional in the autistic neurotype. So what did they do? They used a battery of assessments looking specifically at episodic memory, and they also did assessments to look at the functional circuitry, to look at the hyperconnectivity. Some of the findings were that memory performance for the autistic children was reduced across a lot of the measures. And they did a whole battery of assessments. But in particular, they had weaknesses in memory for what was called general memory. And so that's definitely related to default mode network. We're looking at general cognitive function of memory, but also for facial memory. They found hyperconnectivity primarily in two places. One place that they found hyperconnectivity was in the hippocampus, and the other area that they found hyperconnectivity was in the posterior cingulate cortex. They also found that there is reduced episodic memory performance in these tests. So we're seeing hyperconnectivity across a couple different studies. We're seeing reduced working memory success or efficiency. So a couple different areas where memory is more challenging for autistic children. And so wanting to set that stage of memory being an area of challenge, I then want to pivot to what might be behind music being something that I can speak anecdotally, but also there's really interesting research that has come out in the past and it's continued to be worked on about why music can be so much easier to remember for autistic children. Let's dive into some information about musical memory. I want to teach you more about what melody is, and then I want to share some papers that talk more about how music and melodic processing and pitch processing, to be specific, is an area of strength in the autistic neurotype. It's something that I see down on the ground every day, but it's really exciting to be able to point to and pull from papers that show this at the academic level and at the research level. So we talked about working memory, we talked about episodic memory. What is musical memory? Musical memory is a set of cognitive processes in the brain that allow us as people to process music, encode it, store it, and then retrieve it later on. And this is information related to rhythm, melody, pitch, harmony, and something called musical syntax. Now, musical memory has a lot of different functions and way more than I'm about to list, but musical memory helps you distinguish between Chapel Roan and Chopin. It helps you identify genres. You know that you're listening to rap versus country. Musical memory helps you sing along to songs you have not heard since high school, and how do you still know the words to it? Musical memory is critical in playing an instrument. I would not be able to play my guitar if I did not remember the chord progression. And musical memory is when you hear a little song playing when you're waiting for your train and you know the train is coming. They didn't need to get on the intercom and say, train coming. They played a little song and you remembered what that means. It's a signal for the train to come. Musical memory taps into a range of things. It can tap into really small, concrete units of information, like pressing a note on the piano, and some people have the musical memory of what that exact note is. But for more people, it taps into complex functions that require layered interpretations of remembered musical information. So, for example, I hear a bass line that reminds me of a song I first heard at a wedding when I da 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 and go on and on and on and on. Musical memory can be really rich and multi-layered, or it can be very, very simple. So what is one reason why musical memory might be so strong and so salient for neurotypical individuals, for individuals across different neurotypes, but especially for autistic individuals? One reason might be that memories tend to be easier to recall if they've undergone something called elaborate encoding rather than simple encoding. Now, why might music lead to elaborate encoding? Music activates a vast, and I mean vast, array of brain networks. And something that I find really interesting to read about and look into is how many shared neural networks music has with language. The way that they light up similar networks is hard to ignore. So, music is considered to be elaborately encoded because it requires and it harnesses and it leverages so many different parts of the brain. Now, part of this is we want to think about that elaborate encoding includes the inherent emotional reaction we have to music. It's very hard to listen to music and not have some sort of emotional reaction. And this doesn't necessarily mean crying, feeling overwhelming joy. It means having an emotional preference of, I don't really like that, or I love that. It inherently taps into our preferences, our reward system. Do I feel that dopamine rush when I listen to this song? Do I feel uncomfortable with it? Do I want it to stop? It's inherently tapping into our emotional reactions and our context. Music layers itself on our experiences. You can feel this when perhaps you're at the grocery store and maybe they play a song that you're like, this is a weird song at the grocery store. You can recognize that the context of music, the music can line up with the context you're in, or it can have a mismatch with it. When music lines up well with a certain context, or we hear a certain song during a really emotionally laden activity, they tend to map onto each other and encode deeply in an elaborate way. And information learned through music or information learned with music tends to be encoded with that emotional memory and that contextual memory. It can make the content we've learned more robust. And what's interesting, it makes it less prone to degrade that information over time. As we get older, as we age, perhaps we're experiencing something very stressful, it impacts our memory. If something is learned through or with music, it is less likely to degrade over time, which is really helpful when we're thinking about our jobs as speech language pathologists. We want our interventions to have longevity. And if we're bringing in music, we may be creating more robust memory that doesn't degrade over time. Information embedded in music tends to lend itself well to the gestalt of an experience, where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And something I often talk about when I'm coaching or teaching about this is that music acts as the container, and all of the contents within it can then stay more organized and stay more packaged because it's within that container of a song or a lyric or a musical phrase. It's not all of these free-floating elements. Everything is wrapped up in some sort of lyric or motif, or as we're going to talk about, melody. Now, what's fun is that the exercises I'm going to tell you about later in the episode, I'm actually going to have you tapping into your own musical memory to learn those techniques. So what is melody? Melody is a fundamental aspect of music. It refers to a sequence of musical notes. I think about melody as being horizontal. It happens as time passes. And what's interesting is that it's a sequence of notes, but we perceive melody as a cohesive single element, cohesive single entity. I apologize. So when you think about twinkle, twinkle, little star, you may perceive that as a whole, a gestalt, an entity, rather than do, do, twice, do, twice, do, two times in a row, do, one time. I just pulled all those notes apart. You may not recognize that as Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Let me give you another example of how the notes that make up the melody are different than your perception of the melody. So if I were to sing do 4 times, and then if I were to sing, I apologize, if I were to sing do 3 times, and then do one time and do one time. Would you know what melody that is? I mean, you could tell I flubbed on it because it's really hard to pull out those notes from the entity of the melody. I was referring to Row Your Boat. Do, 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 do. Once I bring it all together, then you can recognize it because it's single, it's cohesive. Now, a melody is typically the part of a song or a piece of music that you hum or sing along to. It's the most recognizable part, the most memorable part. Melodies are sticky. Typically, when we think about melody, we think about like the chorus of a song. Now, if we're going to be more technical, melody is created when someone arranges notes in a particular order with a particular rhythm. These notes can be higher or lower, and songwriters and composers, they often arrange these notes in a pattern that makes it move forward. There's a sense of motion and direction in how these sound waves are interacting with each other. And that's what I want us as speech pathologists who are working with Gestalt language processors to start thinking about. Can we be more intentional about the sound waves we're choosing with our voices to move information forward and make it more memorable? Melodies can be very simple, do, 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 or very complex, think about Mozart, but they always have a sense of progression. Think about a song that is not good. Like if you've heard a song, you're like, that's not good. One reason may be that the melody or the attempted melody does not have a sense of progression. It doesn't move forward. It doesn't feel satisfying to listen to. Melody is made up of things like pitch, which is the highness or lowness of a note. It also includes rhythm, which is how things are timed, how long and how short they are. It can make something groovy, it can make it slow and halting. Melody also plays upon intervals, which are the distances between notes. Somewhere over the rainbow has a big interval jump. Do, do. That is called an octave. But if I did, oh, when the saints do, 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 that's a third. It's not as big of a jump. Those are different intervals. Melodies have contours. That is the shape of the sound. Does it go higher? Da, da, da. That's a rising contour. Or does it have a falling contour? Da, 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 da. Falling contour. Melodies can also have harmonies. Harmonies are hard if you are one person speaking or singing, but if you are speaking or singing with someone else or playing an instrument, that you can play multiple notes at a time, that's the relationship between two or more notes at the same time. And really cool mathematical things happen when we're making harmony, which is a whole other episode. But also, melody is contingent upon something called phrasing. And just like we talk about phrases, something like, let's go, here we go, uh-oh, which I hear is common gestalts for my GLPs, those have really nice, clean phrasing. And phrasing in melody means that there's a sense of beginning, middle, and end for that little musical excerpt. And that's something that's very, very helpful working with Gestalt language processors, is presenting linguistic information in a musical package that has a clear beginning, middle, and end, instead of the ongoing run-on sentences that I used to do when I was working with autistic kids and GLPs. My goodness, I did not stop talking. The information I was providing did not have a good beginning, middle, and end. I am so, so sorry to those GLPs who I did not know were GLPs. So let's look at some articles about why autistic processing of pitch and melody is a little bit different, and why, and these are just a couple of data points and ideas to contribute to this very, very big argument that I am making of why music seems to be so, so helpful for language acquisition. I want to start with a paper from 2014 entitled Pitch Discrimination in Memory by Stanitz, Wapnick, and Barak. So the autistic children and the neurotypical children in this paper, in this study, were between 7 to 13 years old, and all of them were musically untrained. They were presented with pitch discrimination tasks and pitch memory tasks. So they had a couple of different tasks. One, The kids had to indicate if two isolated pitches, and those are single notes, so like do, do, those are two different pitches. The children had to identify if those were the same pitch or different pitches. Now, what's interesting is that they made the differences so subtle. Subtle enough that it would be hard for me to replicate it with my voice, but they would alter the pitch up or down by just a couple of hertz. So they would just alter the sound wave a little tiny bit to a degree that most people wouldn't know the difference or notice the difference if they weren't really listening. Then they had the kids listen to two different melodies. Remember that what a melody is. They had those kids determine, is this the same melody or the different melody? Now, depending on the trial, again, they took this the first note of that second melody and they shifted it just a little bit up or just a little bit down. The third task they did was they presented the children with four short melodies with a very clear phrase, very clear beginning and end. And then a week later, they saw if they could remember them. So they were doing discrimination, but they were also looking at memory, melodic memory. So here's what they found. I thought this was so interesting. These musically untrained autistic kids had enhanced memory for pitches, enhanced memory for telling apart what just happened previously and what is happening now. They also had enhanced discrimination of pitches. They were better able to tell the difference between the slightly shifted pitches than neurotypical kids were in this study. They also had superior long-term memory for those melodies in 1 week later. So it seems like they were better able to encode that memory and then call upon it than the neurotypical kids were able to do, which is really interesting and is something that I see reflected in the GLPs that I work with, of the clientele of all the SLPs that I support and work with, and so much of the anecdotal information and all the anecdotes that we're collecting about GLPs is that their long-term memory for music is really, really notable. Now, one of the original researchers for pitch and melody when it comes to autistic individuals was Pamela Heaton. She did research in the early 2000s and kind of set the stage for a lot of the ideas that I pull from in my work. So she did a lot of different studies, but she looked at autistic children who had lower support needs. And she wanted to see what their pitch memory was like, as well as their ability to label different pitches. So for example, if you just played a note on piano, could they name it? Which is a really interesting skill called perfect pitch, and is something that I do see in quite a few of the GLPs I've worked with. And if they don't have perfect pitch, they tend to have something called relative pitch. And I am very, 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 very jealous of that. I wish I had those skills. So in the experiments that Pamela Heaton did and published in this paper, she found that the autistic group had enhanced pitch memory compared to the neurotypical kids. They also had enhanced pitch labeling. They were better able to name the notes that they heard, which is really impressive. And they also found that what was interesting is that the autistic kids were better able to segment different musical chords that they heard. And so let's say they played 3 notes of the piano at the same time. The autistic kids were better able to figure out what notes were part of that chord, which is another like really notable skill, to be able to tell those different frequencies apart when all of them hit their ear at the same moment, being able to what's called disembedding it. So because pitch information, autistic kids in many, many studies are seen to have better attunement to different pitch information, but also enhanced memory for pitches and enhanced memory for melodies. I argue that it would be, when we're thinking about making our sessions most effective, would it be in our best interest, for the best interest of our clients' goals, to use things like singing, like melody, or exaggerated contours in speech? I know a lot of people say, like, I can't sing, I don't want to sing, or the clients I work with, they reject me singing. We can think about just using exaggerated contours instead of something like, let's go outside. You could elongate the vowels and make the contours bigger, like, let's go outside. You're still getting deeper, like richer pitch information there and making a little bit more melodic without singing. But I argue that things like singing and using exaggerated contours, I feel that they can naturally increase the saliency of pitch information and tap into those memory centers. My hope is that this might increase attentional resources and reduce the working memory load, or just reduce load in general, to be better able to allocate towards the signal. If we're making the musical information easier to process and encode, then perhaps the linguistic information that is packed into that melody will be easier to tap into for the child who is listening to you. Now, I love this paper. I was so excited when this one came out. This one is by Weiss et al., 2021, and it's called Enhanced Memory for Vocal Melodies in Autism Spectrum Disorder and Williams Syndrome. So they also looked at Williams Syndrome, which is a really interesting population that tends to have, musical proclivity. But I'm only going to be speaking about the autistic participants in this, because that is what this episode is about. So this study jumped off from previous research that typically developing kids and TD adults, we tend to remember vocal melodies. So singing like this, like songs with just voices, better than instrumental melodies. So for example, if I grab my piano and I play da 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 da, the same melody that I did with my voice, it's easier to remember it if a human voice does it than an instrument. So this is thought to be because humans, we are biologically wired to pay more attention to human voices. They're important for social communication, and they can provide deeper signaling and more like robust communicative intent than a piano can. So these researchers, they wanted to look into whether vocal melodies were easier to remember for other populations, and for our purposes, autistic kids. So there are 26 autistic kids. They looked at 26 kids and adults with Williams syndrome, and then 26 kids who are typically developing. And they had them listen to 12 different folk songs, unfamiliar folk songs with different melodies. Some of them were sung with voices. Some of those folk melodies were played on instruments like piano or marimba. So then there was a memory test, where the participants had to decide if the melody was something that they had heard before or something that they hadn't heard before. So all of the groups were able to tell apart old melodies from new ones, but there were differences in how well they remembered those melodies. Not just the discrimination of I've heard it before or I haven't heard it before. That would be recognition. But being able to actually remember those melodies, the autistic kids had the same memory advantage for vocal melodies as the typically developing kids. And any paper where I'm seeing that the autistic kids have the same advantage or processing or demonstrating the same skill level as neurotypical kids, I'm paying attention. Because so much of working with autistic kids, or so much that we hear, especially in places like schools or in medical settings where it's all about deficit, 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 it's really exciting to be able to say, hey, look at this. This is an area where my client has a similar advantage, and we can leverage this strength, truly a strengths-based approach based on the research. Can we leverage the strength to help rise up these other areas like expressive language? And so they had a same memory advantage for vocal melodies. And what it suggests is that even though these groups have very different presentations and very different skills and abilities in a lot of other areas, the processing and the memory of sung melodies is similar to typically developing kids? Can we use the singing of melodies where we just happen to put really rich language that we are, is playing to their language goals within those melodies so that they are easier to discriminate, they're easier to remember? I want my clients to be using their working memory for other things. I want their cognitive resources on the language itself, not and using melody as a way to kind of carry that meaning and make it easier for them to remember. So, what about techniques? We have talked about some of the differences in the autistic neurotype when it comes to things like working memory, when it comes to things like short-term and long-term memory, which are really, really, when it comes to primarily when we're thinking about working memory, because that's so important for language acquisition. I then told you a little bit about musical memory and some of the reasons, such as elaborate encoding, why musical memory tends to be so robust and why musical information tends to be so salient and easy to draw from. Then I shared a couple of papers that speak to some of the musical processing differences in the autistic neurotype, as well as the advantages that the autistic neurotype is showing when it comes to musical processing and musical learning. But it's always important to try and come away from talks like this with, what do I do? Now, I could give you a blanket recommendation and say, go sing everything, but that's not reasonable for a lot of settings. It's not very precise. And if you've worked with Gestalt language processors, you know that you're going to have some clients who tell you not to sing. And so we want to just kind of look at some ideas of how to bring in like the structure of music, as well as give you different angles to try out melody, because one approach may not work for a client, but another one in this list of melodic techniques may actually work for that client. If I've had clients where they reject one melodic strategy, and I think, my first thought is, because, of course, hurt feelings is, well, fine, no melodies then. But if I pivot to another melodic technique, they're actually fine with it because it's the way that the information is packaged that they were rejecting in the first place. So there are 3 melodic techniques I want to go through in this episode. One is called piggybacking, which is actually a songwriting technique, but it draws upon melody. One is called a staircase melody. That's my name for it, but in the wider world talking about this, they call it stepwise melodies. But I like staircase. I find it easier to remember and for parents and teachers to remember. I found over time they remember staircase better than they do stepwise. So that's what I call it. And then another one I call mountain melodies. And I like to give techniques memorable names that have a nice visual component, like a staircase or a mountain or a piggyback, because I find that when there is analogy and imagery, it's easier to remember. So trying to help your memory about memory. First of all, let's talk about piggybacking. Piggybacking is a songwriting technique that is often used in places like education spheres, definitely used in music therapy. I pull a lot of information and inspiration for my work as a musical speech language pathologist from the music therapy world. So shout out to them. They are doing really incredible work with the autistic population. But piggybacking is also used by speech language pathologists. What it does is it leverages the structure of music for learning outcomes. So what is piggybacking? It's when you take an established existing melody. So maybe the wheels on the bus go round and round. If I cut out the words da 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 da, I use that established memory as the container, and then I put in novel or slightly modulated lyrics. The ideas behind this is that by borrowing the established melody, the child is going to recognize that container. They might feel really rewarded by it, excited by it. You might be taking their favorite song. But the other side of it is that if they're not having to process novel melodic information, we would hope that they could then allocate more cognitive resources to processing the novel contents, which are the words or the phrases, or what I would hope to become a linguistic gestalt. And we can then take that piggybacked melody and tailor it to the exact therapeutic context. Now, maybe that is you're playing with a certain toy. Maybe you're doing therapy in someone's home, and so you're doing a daily routine. Maybe you're in outpatient and you are co-treating with a PT. You need this child to do some sort of mobility exercise. You could piggyback a melody and put in a lyric about them doing their mobility exercise. You can put in really any novel lyric or even kind of like a Mad Lib situation, which I'll give you examples of. And you can kind of tuck it into the existing melody that child already knows. And if they don't already know it, you already know it, which is helping with your allocation of cognitive resources. I know you have so many other things to think about when you are working with your clients. Piggybacking is a way to bring in melody and music where you don't have to be a songwriter. Well, a little bit, but you don't have to come up with a brand new melody. You don't have to be a composer, I should have said. But piggybacking is a way to take musical melodic information and just put in the words that make sense for that moment. Here are some examples I've heard recently. Row, row, row your boat. I often hear this piggyback to wash, wash, wash your hands, wash them nice and clean. And this is one where I've seen it in a couple of my clients where they originally knew Row Your Boat and they would sing it or say it when they saw a boat or whatever their personal meaning was. But then they were able to then shift that and mitigate it to wash, wash, wash your hands when they were washing their hands. So it became a little bit more flexible through piggybacking. Another one I hear is variations on I like to eat apples and bananas. And one is I like to drink, drink, drink yummy lemonade. And so it's keeping that musical structure. It's keeping the melodic structure. The rhythm doesn't change unless there's syllabic difference in the word that you're putting in. But it's that same container, but novel contents. And that is a phrase that if you've heard me speak before in episodes or done any of my professional development, you're sick of hearing. Same container, novel contents, or predictable container, novel contents, which is my go-to for working with GLPs across a variety of goals. Now, I wanted to include some practice steps for piggybacking. And these are steps that I go back to, even sometimes for myself. If I need help piggybacking with something that's a little more challenging, I'll go back to these steps to help myself through it. Step 1 for piggybacking. Start with a song you know by heart. Don't mess with something that you're not completely sure of. And that's why nursery rhymes are a go-to when working with children. But you might not be an aficionado of nursery rhymes, and that's where I'd recommend pulling from the classics. I've had people who do really well when they use Beatles songs as for piggybacking. So like da 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 da. Let's say you want to take Hey Jude, excuse me, and you want to tailor it to your client and sing something like, Hey you, it's time to sleep. You just piggyback that right in there to a melody that you know by heart because you've been singing it your whole life. But now the lyrics have to do with that moment that you're trying to turn into a gestalt with that stage 1 GLP. Now, children's songs can be really helpful, but also Beatles songs because both of those can be pretty repetitive, short, easy to sing. And it makes it easier to kind of craft and modulate the lyrics. I also recommend printing out or writing out lyrics that you would want to piggyback so you can cross out or replace or type in the new words. Sometimes seeing the lyrics makes it clearer what you can creatively replace. So I'll write out, I just had a Gestalt language processor last week where we were implementing this technique. We wrote down the lyrics to Five Little Monkeys Jumping on the Bed, which is a favorite of his. And I had his mom underline the words or the places where it would be easy for her to engage in this piggybacking. And once she saw it written out, she goes, oh, this is easier than I thought. I see all the animal names or all the nouns, and I can just sub those in. So using the visual as a support is helpful. I also recommend as you're building this piggybacking skill, make small changes. Instead of changing all of the lyrics, and that's from years of practice of this, I can think of a song and replace every single word in it on the fly. That's a lot of practice. In the beginning, I like to think about pick one position in that lyric And you can think about it like, am I going to change out the noun? Am I going to change out the adjective? I'm going to change out the verb, or I'm going to change out the preposition. So one example might be itsy bitsy spider. You might decide, let me change out the nouns. The itsy bitsy dinosaur went up the... See, this is where writing it down would be helpful. The itsy bitsy dinosaur went up the water spout. I was trying to think of ways to change the water spout into different nouns. So maybe the dinosaur could go up the mountainside. Okay, that feels more related to what I might be playing with the kid. The itsy bitsy dinosaur went up the mountainside. I'm going to get dark here. Down came the meteor. And I will stop there. But I'm thinking about, okay, let me replace just the nouns. I'm not thinking about every part of speech, but I think about one part of speech at a time. And it helps me focus in and make decisions about what to replace. Now, piggybacking is a muscle you can build. I do promise that. Just like we can support the clients we're working with in building their skills slowly and building those muscles, so can you. This might feel like something overwhelming, but by doing small changes and singing the song a few times until you're comfortable with it, then adding more changes after, you're going to be building that muscle. Number 5, please do not worry about rhyming. That is a whole added layer of difficulty that you don't need to worry about. The more you practice piggybacking with your clients, that sounds so silly. I'm imagining you giving piggyback rides the whole time, which is a great activity for GLPs because movement, movement, movement. But don't worry about rhyming. That'll come later. The more you practice, you'll be able to more easily think about rhymes that'll fit right in. But for now, just doesn't have to be perfect. The goal is to make the language information come across in a more salient, memorable way. Remember, we're thinking about memory, memory, memory here. You can work on rhyming later. And then the 6th one that helps with your memory, but also the memory of your clients, potentially, is to record yourself singing it and listen back. That's going to help you. But also taking a video of this piggybacked song, especially if you're doing the skill you want that child to do. So for example, wash, wash, wash your hands, that whole song. Take a video of yourself washing your hands while you sing it and watch it back with that child. You are now giving them this package of meaning that could become a gestalt. And more often than not, I'm finding my clients acquire that song as a new gestalt when they watch me on the video I made rather than me doing it live the first time. So that's piggybacking. Another one that I listed was this idea of a stepwise melody. And stepwise, I call it staircase. A rising staircase or a rising stepwise melody is when the notes go in an upward order. So, for example, do 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 do. It is time to wake up. Da 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 da. I imagine those notes rising upward. The frequency of them is getting faster. The pitch is rising. I like to use a rising staircase or a rising stepwise melody for a couple of different purposes with a GLP. And remember, thinking back, I mentioned, can your voice and your musicality match what that child's body is feeling? Can you match it up? So here's where I use a rising melody. I use it when we're transitioning out of somewhere, kind of emerging from one place to the next. It's this rising feeling. I use rising staircase melodies, da, 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 when something is getting bigger or higher. I also use a rising staircase melody when I'm asking a question or making a request. Can I have a cookie? It's kind of got that, oh, please feeling underneath it. And I also use rising stepwise or staircase melodies when I'm talking about something hopeful. I really want to go to the park. I'm excited. I'm hopeful. And so my voice is slowly getting higher and higher in a way that's very logical. There aren't big unexpected jumps. It's not going up and down and up and down and up and down. there's logic to it because it's as predictable as a staircase going up, which the hope would be that it's reducing the amount of cognitive resources needed to process the pitch relationships, because the person listening, hopefully their brain is going to realize what's coming next is probably going to be a little bit higher, just like the next step on a staircase is going to be higher, hopefully not lower. Falling staircase is the opposite. This is when the melody of something that you're singing to a child goes down in order. So da 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 da, or da da da, high, middle, low, da 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 da. I like to use falling melodies for kind of the opposite of the rising melodies. I'm trying to capture that underlying feeling of perhaps arriving somewhere. When we've arrived, we're here. We made it. Boom, we made it. I use falling staircase melodies when I talk about something ending. Every time a client leaves the clinic, we sing, "It's time to say bye-bye. Da 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 da." And that's a falling staircase. The notes are close together and they're going down one by one. I like to use falling melodies when I am talking about something getting smaller or lower. Here we go. Bum, bum, bum. Here we go. It's getting small, I'm getting lower. And here we go is something I like to say when we like fall off of the swing into the crash pad. But I also use falling staircase melodies when I'm trying to capture sadness in a potential sung gestalt. So, oh no, I'm so sad. Da 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 da. Sounds like my voice is going down a staircase. So rising staircase and falling staircase, these are ones that I really recommend trying out. See what happens with your voice when you try and sing in a way that it goes down a little bit each time or goes up a little bit each time. Try and match up these melodies to the underlying feeling. Is it happiness, sadness? Is it something growing, getting higher, shrinking, smaller or lower down? Are you transitioning into an activity or out of an activity? The way that you choose to vibrate your vocal cords and how long you choose to vibrate them can have such an impact on not just how a child responds to your voice and the linguistic content, but if they even notice it in the first place. And what I find again and again is that melodies tend to cut through the rest of the noise. GLPs pay more attention when things are sung than spoken in a general sense. The last melodic technique I want to share is what I call a mountain melody. And the reason I use mountain melodies speaks back to a Gestalt principle that was developed by Max Wertheimer. And he was the Gestalt psychologist who talked about his 6 Gestalt laws or 6 Gestalt principles. Definitely give a listen to the episode called "So What is a Gestalt?" to learn more about that. But I use mountain melodies because to me, they're in line with the Gestalt principle of symmetry, which is something starting and ending either visually in the same place or we're talking about acoustically. A mountain melody has symmetry, where the first note and its relationship to the middle note is the same as the middle note's relationship to the last note, but just flipped, like there's a mirror between them. So what would that sound like? Da, da, da. First, middle, last. First, last are the same note. There's symmetry in the melody that I'm singing. A more complex one would be da 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 or da 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 da. There's symmetry on either side of that middle note. And what this can do is create a very clear sense of beginning, middle, end, which is something that we talked about earlier as potentially being very helpful for a child who's trying to make sense of the acoustic environment and know what a unit is, what is being parsed out in their acoustic environment. So a mountain melody might sound something like, "Here we go again, here we go again. ba da 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 da. It started and ended in the same place. It's symmetrical. And I kind of kept those notes close together. It's a very small mountain, da 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 da, but you can hear that mountain shape in my voice, up and down. I might also do a really big mountain in my melody to capture something really exciting. I want to go to the park. Ba da 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 da. I'm making that mountain with my voice, and there's a very clear package around those words with that mountain melody. So we talked about piggybacking, we talked about stepwise or staircase, and we talked about mountain melodies. So let's do a quick review of what we talked about in this episode. We really started to just scratch the surface. And if you've listened to my content before, you're probably also sick of me hearing about scratching the surface. I want to make it so clear that there is so much information about autism out there. There's so much information from so many different disciplines with different ways of measuring and looking and quantifying all of these concepts that we want to learn about so that we can help the clients that we care about so much. I emphasize that we're scratching the surface because it's really important that you come away from continuing education like this or podcast episodes like this with exciting things to try out, but also it's very clear that these are not the answers. And I have only provided just a little bit of information to continue to build your knowledge and your decision making. There's no way I can present everything that we need to know about melody and memory in an episode like this, or even an entire series. But what I can do is provide you with powerful buzzwords, ideas and techniques to bring with you, and a starting point to, or a middle point to continue building your awareness of Gestalt language processing, the autistic neurotype, and where you might want to go next. So I hope that you'll continue to scratch the surface with me when it comes to Gestalt language processing and working with autistic children. Working with this population is the absolute joy of my life. And I love being able to share my other passion, which is music. I'm really looking forward to hearing about ways that you start to bring music into your practice with GLPs, whether that is through piggybacking, if you're trying out some of these stepwise functions, or just by starting to sing a little bit more with the clients in your life. And so, as we come to the end of the episode, as a reminder, if you're joining for the live course and your state license requires live CEUs, be sure to complete all course modules, including the one that says complete course, before the end of the day on your speech therapy PD account. If you need additional support in completing the course, please stay for a video tutorial on how to complete the course. But we actually have some time for questions. And so if you're interested in asking a question about Gestalt language processing, melody, or memory, I will certainly do my best to provide information. And if I can't, you're definitely going to give me ideas for future episodes. And I hope to provide you with recommendations for where to dig for the answers. Cindy, thank you so much. Cindy said, phew, so much great info. My brain is exploding. Yes, that is me every day. Every time I read a new paper, my brain is exploding. There's so much rich information out there, and it's dizzying sometimes. It's really exciting though. Susan said, this is excellent. Oh yes, melodic intonation therapy is a technique for my thesis. I considered bringing that into this episode, but that is a whole other episode on its own. If you haven't heard of melodic intonation therapy, please go look it up. It is fantastic. It is derived from work with patients with aphasia, but it is really promising for autistic individuals. KK, thank you so much. KK said, for specific steps for Melodies techniques, you make it seem possible, even fun. I try and have fun. I don't know how we can do this job without trying to have fun. And I know that if you're not a musician, bringing music in can seem pretty daunting, and I completely respect and understand that. I think that so much of this comes back to playfulness, and being willing to sound really silly and sound potentially really bad. The techniques that I shared are from years of sounding really silly and really bad. But then the moments when it worked was saying, okay, that moment did not sound bad and it really worked out. But I can't spare you from that same fate. I'm just saying that in my experience, and this is just for me, bringing music in and trying this stuff out it's really unbelievable, the impacts I've seen. Samantha says, you knew about GLP and was already using these strategies without knowing it. Awesome. Yes. This course just put everything into place and made me understand so much better. It helped me understand why singing with my kiddos worked. Exactly. That is another one of my goals and passions, is to give you the why. There's so much about being a speech therapist, especially if you love working with children, autistic kids, that's intuition. You're like, I know this works. I know it, or I know the gist of why it works. I love sharing some of the why behind it, so you can point to the brain and be like, that, because that's really helpful for advocacy. And when people are like, why are you singing? Why are you singing for an hour? Here's my 152 sources for why. Dara asked, do your students also like it when you play instruments for them? Totally depends. Totally depends on the client. I just started with a little boy last week where on paper I was like, you are gonna love my guitar. It's gonna be great. As soon as I hit that first strum, first session, he reached out and he scratched my face. He was so distressed by it, that he tried to protect himself from me and the guitar. So it really depends on the kid. And some kids only want me to play the instrument. They do not want to hear my voice. So I think it really depends on their auditory sensitivity, their previous experiences with instruments. Maybe that child who scratched me, a guitar was encoded as part of a painful or fearful gestalt previous to me. But I think instruments are a really helpful kind of third thing. God, there was a paper. Oh, I wish I could reference it. I'm telling you, my memory is. This is why I study memory, is because mine is bad. I'm trying to learn for more than just my clients. But there was a paper about the idea that when there's it was a music therapy journal. When there's an instrument between you and the client, it kind of reduces the pressure, and having this third thing to focus on. The instrument can kind of be like the gathering point, and it takes the communicative pressure off of the child. Like, you don't have to like make eye contact or anything. So sometimes having that instrument is like the biggest diffuser, because it's like we're both paying attention to, we're sharing the moment over this third thing that makes sound. It almost has a life of its own. And it could be really, really special. But yeah, also sometimes I get drums thrown in my head. So don't use heavy instruments, and don't use instruments that you don't want broken, because I so many broken instruments. But it's worth it. It's worth it. Oh, okay. Oh my gosh, Danielle, I'm so sorry I missed yours. Should we apply this idea of melody music to all types of language? Should we focus mostly on more on functional language? It seems like the dinosaurs are climbing the mountainside to music would be less practical for the child than the hand washing song, since the routine is used regularly. Great question. Oh, I love it. It depends on the kid and how you're using it. So sometimes using the special interest-based language that's the way in for the kid. They're not going to pay attention to more functional language. It doesn't light it up for them. They don't care. And so much about my experience working with autistic kids is like, am I adding value to what they're doing? If I'm not adding value to it, forget it. This Corinne lady, whatever. The dinosaur language may not be functional across like the wider swath of their linguistic world, but getting that buy-in in the beginning for them to like fall in love with what language can do, then I might start with that kid. But like the practical language, if that kid is ready for that, if they don't need to kind of fall in love with language through their special interests first, then you can go right to like the practicality. You can also kind of like meet somewhere in the middle where you're constructing lyrics that have really promising grammatical, like forward-thinking grammar patterns, but you just happen to be popping in special interest language. So it's kind of a balance of like practicality with words and activities that kid actually wants to pay attention to. All right, so I'm so glad I didn't miss your question, Danielle. That was fantastic. That brings us to the end of the episode. Thank you so much to everyone who joined for our live recording, and also shout out to everyone who's listening again on streaming services. I look forward to seeing you back again for another episode of the Gestalt Get Together. If you would like to get in touch with me, please feel free to reach out on Instagram at crescendo.communication.com. If you have any topics you would like to hear us talk about on the podcast, please do not be shy. And if you have any stories about your GLP, or if you've done any of